On a peaceful afternoon in the heart of the city, golden rays of sunlight bathed the streets, casting long shadows that danced across the sidewalks. The air was filled with a calming stillness, broken only by the soft hum of distant traffic and the gentle chirping of birds. It was the kind of afternoon that invited people to slow down, breathe deeply, and simply exist in the moment. Lana Tyson walked along the sun-drenched street, her footsteps falling into a steady rhythm against the pavement. For her, these walks were more than just a way to stretch her legs. They were a form of escape, a brief reprieve from the heavy expectations that came with being the daughter of a legend. As the daughter of Mike Tyson, one of the greatest boxers in history, Lana often felt the crushing weight of the public eye. But out here, with the sun on her face and the wind brushing past her, she could just be Lana, not a Tyson, not a name, not a symbol, but simply herself. Her long dark hair fluttered in the breeze as she strolled past rows of charming storefronts and cozy cafes. With each step, she felt her mind relax, letting go of the constant thoughts about her future, her father's legacy, and the countless eyes always watching. This was her time, her sanctuary, where she could just be a young woman enjoying the simplicity of life. Lana adjusted her headphones, letting the soft hum of her favorite song drift through her ears as she moved through the peaceful streets. The music blended perfectly with the calm atmosphere, creating a sense of harmony that she so rarely experienced. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing herself to truly feel the warmth of the sun on her skin, the serenity of the afternoon wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. But sometimes, peace is fragile, so delicate that it can be shattered in an instant. Unbeknownst to Lana, as she walked with a light heart and an easy smile, danger lurked nearby. A shadow loomed in the distance, hidden behind the tinted windows of a slowly approaching police cruiser. Inside sat Officer Jack Reynolds, a man whose mind was clouded with prejudice and power. His eyes followed Lana as the car crept forward, his gaze laced with suspicion and disdain. For Lana, this walk was meant to be a peaceful escape from the pressures of her life. She had no idea that in a matter of moments, her world would be turned upside down, and the serenity she cherished would give way to a confrontation that would test her courage and her father's love, like never before. As Lana Tyson continued her peaceful walk, enjoying the sunlit afternoon, the calm atmosphere began to shift. A subtle tension filled the air, like the calm before a storm. She noticed a police cruiser slowly creeping up behind her, its engine humming low but steady. The windows were tinted dark, but she could feel the weight of someone's gaze pressing down on her. Instinctively, her heart started to race, though she tried to dismiss the feeling as paranoia. Suddenly, the sharp wail of a siren pierced the stillness, making Lana jump. The cruiser swerved to the curb, its tires screeching against the pavement. Lana froze, her eyes wide as the driver's side door swung open, revealing Officer Jack Reynolds. Dressed in his standard-issue uniform, with a badge gleaming under the sunlight, Reynolds stepped out with a menacing air. His face was hardened, his jaw clenched, and his eyes held a mixture of contempt and authority. "Hey, you!" he barked, his voice booming through the quiet street. Lana turned, confusion etched across her face. She took a cautious step back, her mind racing to make sense of the situation. "Me?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with nerves. "Yeah, you," Reynolds growled, closing the gap between them. His hand hovered near his belt, where his baton hung ominously. "What are you doing around here?" Lana's brows furrowed. "I'm just walking," she replied, trying to maintain her composure. "Is that a problem?" Her calm defiance seemed to only inflame Reynolds further. His face twisted with anger, and his eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he sneered. Lana's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to back down. "What description is that?" she shot back, her voice stronger now. Reynolds' lips curled into a cruel smile. "Don't get smart with me," he hissed. "Show me some ID." Lana shook her head, standing her ground. "You have no reason to stop me. I haven't done anything wrong." In an instant, the situation escalated. Reynolds lunged forward, grabbing Lana's wrist tightly. She gasped in shock, struggling to pull away, but his grip was ironclad. Without warning, he yanked out his baton and swung it, the metal flashing in the sunlight before it made brutal contact with her shoulder. Lana stumbled, pain shooting through her body as she hit the ground hard, her breath knocked out of her. The world around her blurred for a moment. But through the ringing in her ears, she heard Reynolds snarling, "Next time, listen when I talk to you." Her body ached, her head throbbed, but something inside her refused to break. Gritting her teeth, Lana glared up at the officer, her spirit defiant even in the face of injustice. Little did Reynolds know this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As Lana lay on the cold pavement, pain radiating through her shoulder, she struggled to catch her breath. The harsh impact of Officer Reynolds' baton had left her dazed but not broken. Her hands trembled as she tried to push herself up, but before she could regain her footing, she heard the ominous sound of heavy boots approaching. Looking up through tear-filled eyes, she saw Reynolds towering over her, his baton still clenched in his hand, his face twisted with a toxic mix of anger and power. "You should have done what I said," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Lana's heart pounded in her chest, but a wave of anger surged through her pain. She gritted her teeth and met his gaze. "You can't do this," she spat out, her voice shaking but filled with defiance. Reynolds scoffed, stepping even closer. "I can do whatever I want," he growled, raising the baton again, as if ready to strike her once more. But before the baton could descend, a deep, thunderous voice echoed through the alleyway, stopping Reynolds in his tracks. "That's enough." The command was sharp, powerful, and filled with rage. Both Lana and Reynolds turned their heads toward the voice. There, at the mouth of the alley, stood Mike Tyson. His massive frame was tense, his muscles coiled like a spring ready to explode. His face, usually calm and collected, was now a mask of pure fury. His dark eyes locked onto Reynolds, burning with a fire that made even the crooked officer take a step back. Reynolds hesitated for a moment, his grip on the baton faltering. "This is none of your business, old man," he snapped, though his voice wavered with fear. Mike took a step forward, the ground almost vibrating beneath his feet. "That's my daughter," he growled, his voice low and threatening. "And you just made the worst mistake of your life." Reynolds' bravado crumbled in an instant. He glanced down at Lana, then back up at Mike, realizing the gravity of the situation. His hands shook as he tried to maintain control, but it was too late. Mike's fists clenched tightly at his sides, his knuckles turning white. The tension in the air was electric, every second stretching out painfully. "You think that badge gives you power?" Mike continued, his voice rising. "You think you can hurt my daughter and walk away?" Reynolds stammered, trying to backpedal. She was resisting, but Mike cut him off. "She was walking, that's all, and you attacked her." In that moment, the fear in Reynolds' eyes was undeniable. The predator had become the prey. Mike stepped closer, his towering figure casting a shadow over the officer. Lana, still on the ground, watched her father with a mix of awe and relief, knowing that justice was about to be served. Mike Tyson's towering figure loomed over Officer Reynolds, his presence radiating pure, unfiltered rage. The former heavyweight champion's fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white, his jaw set with unrelenting fury. The alley, once filled with the sharp echo of Reynolds' aggression, now fell into a heavy silence, thick with tension. The crooked officer, who moments ago had wielded his baton with unchecked authority, now stood frozen, the reality of who he was facing sinking in. "I'm not going to say it again," Mike growled, his deep voice reverberating through the alley. "Step away from my daughter." Reynolds took a shaky step back, his baton still raised but now trembling in his hand. He tried to muster his bravado, his voice cracking under pressure. I was just doing my job. She resisted." "Don't lie to me." Mike's roar echoed like a thunderclap, silencing Reynolds instantly. His eyes, filled with an intense, almost primal fire, locked onto the officer. "I saw everything." Lana, still on the ground but slowly sitting up, watched as her father took another step forward, his muscles rippling with controlled fury. Her heart raced, both from the pain in her shoulder and the raw energy radiating from her father. She had seen him angry before, but never like this. This was something deeper, a protective rage that couldn't be tamed. Reynolds, realizing he was in real danger, raised his baton higher, but his hands shook violently. "Back off, Tyson," he barked, though his voice lacked any real authority. "Don't make me use this." Mike's eyes narrowed, a mocking smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "You really think that'll stop me?" he taunted. In a split second, like lightning striking, Mike lunged forward. His speed, honed from years in the ring, was blinding. With one swift motion, he knocked the baton out of Reynolds' hand, sending it clattering to the ground. The crooked officer barely had time to react before Mike's massive fist connected with his jaw in a devastating right hook. The sound of bone meeting bone echoed through the alley, followed by the dull thud of Reynolds' body hitting the pavement. The crowd that had gathered gasped in shock, some pulling out their phones to record, while others simply stood frozen, witnessing the brutal display of raw power and justice. Reynolds groaned, trying to push himself up, but Mike wasn't finished. He grabbed Reynolds by the collar, hoisting him off the ground with terrifying ease. "You like hitting people who can't fight back?" Mike snarled, his voice laced with venom. "How does it feel now?" Reynolds whimpered, his earlier bravado completely shattered. Please, I didn't mean—" Mike's fist cocked back, ready to deliver another punishing blow, but then, from the corner of his eye, he saw Lana watching, her face filled with a mixture of pain, pride, and concern. His heart clenched. She had already been through enough. With a deep, controlled breath, Mike let Reynolds go, dropping him like a rag doll onto the ground. "You're lucky she's watching," he growled, stepping back. Reynolds lay there, broken and humiliated, as sirens echoed in the distance. Reinforcements were on their way, but the real justice had already been served. The distant wail of police sirens grew louder, their flashing lights reflecting off the surrounding buildings as backup finally arrived at the chaotic scene. The alleyway, which had been shrouded in violence and tension just moments ago, now filled with a strange, almost eerie calm. Mike Tyson stood tall, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, his fists still clenched at his sides. Beside him, Lana struggled to her feet, her body aching but her spirit unbroken, watching as justice continued to unfold. Two police cruisers screeched to a halt at the alley's entrance, doors flying open as uniformed officers spilled out, weapons drawn in confusion. They took in the scene, Officer Reynolds lying crumpled on the ground, his face swollen and bloodied, Mike Tyson looming over him, and Lana standing a few feet away, bruised but defiant. "Drop your weapon," one of the officers shouted, misinterpreting the scene, aiming his gun directly at Mike. But before Mike could respond, Lana stepped forward, her voice clear and commanding despite her injuries. "He's not the problem. That officer—" She pointed at Reynolds, who now groaned and struggled to sit up. "Attacked me without cause. My dad saved me." The officers hesitated, lowering their weapons slightly, exchanging uncertain glances. It was clear they hadn't expected this. One of the senior officers, Sergeant Miller, pushed through the group, his face stern but searching for answers. He knelt beside Reynolds, who was still dazed from Mike's powerful punches. "Reynolds, what the hell happened here?" he demanded. Reynolds coughed, blood dribbling from the corner of his mouth, but he still tried to defend himself. She was resisting. I was following protocol." But before the sergeant could respond, several bystanders who had been filming the incident came forward, their phones raised high. "We got it all on video," one of them said firmly. "That cop attacked her for no reason, and then he assaulted her." Another officer grabbed one of the phones, reviewing the footage. His face paled as the truth became undeniable. Sergeant Miller turned back to Reynolds, now filled with disgust. "You're done," he growled, ripping the badge off Reynolds' uniform before motioning for another officer to cuff him. As Reynolds was hoisted to his feet, now wearing handcuffs, he glared weakly at Mike. "This isn't over," he muttered bitterly. Mike stepped closer, his voice low but seething with restrained fury. "You're right," he replied, "but this time it's the law that's coming for you." The officers led Reynolds away, his figure shrinking in the distance as the flashing lights painted the alley red and blue. The once crooked cop was finally going to face real justice, not just from the streets, but from the system he had abused. Mike turned to Lana, his anger giving way to relief. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "Yeah, thanks to you." Father and daughter stood together under the glow of the sirens, the weight of the moment sinking in. Though bruised and shaken, they had made it through, together. And as they walked away from the alley, the crowd that had gathered began to clap, not just for Mike's strength, but for the undeniable power of a father's love and the pursuit of justice. As the dust settled and the flashing red and blue lights painted the alleyway, a heavy stillness hung in the air. Officer Jack Reynolds, now in handcuffs, was being led away by his fellow officers, his head bowed, his face swollen and bloodied from the brutal reckoning Mike Tyson had delivered. The once cocky and aggressive officer was now a shell of the man he had been just moments earlier. The smug arrogance that had fueled his abuse of power was gone, replaced by a mixture of shame, fear, and barely concealed rage. Mike Tyson stood a few feet away, his broad chest still heaving as adrenaline coursed through his veins. His fists were unclenched now, but the intensity in his eyes hadn't faded. He watched as Reynolds was shoved into the back of a police cruiser, the heavy metallic clunk of the door slamming shut, echoing through the alley like a final verdict. The crowd that had gathered remained eerily silent, many still holding their phones up, recording every moment as evidence of the injustice they had witnessed, and the justice that had been served. One officer, a younger man who had watched everything unfold, approached Mike cautiously. There was a mixture of awe and respect in his eyes as he spoke. "I saw the footage. You did what anyone would have done, maybe even more." His voice trailed off, understanding the magnitude of what had just happened. Mike nodded slightly, his eyes shifting to Lana, who stood beside him, her arm still sore from the brutal strike but her spirit unbroken. She was bruised, but she held her head high, a defiant glint in her eyes. The bond between father and daughter had been tested and strengthened through this ordeal. The crowd began to murmur softly, conversations flowing as people shared their thoughts on the events they had just witnessed. Many praised Mike for standing up against the abuse of power, while others were still in shock at how quickly things had escalated. But amidst the whispers, one older man, dressed in plain clothes, stepped forward. His voice, though low, carried weight as he said, "This is the kind of courage we need. Someone willing to stand up when no one else will." Mike glanced at him, then at Lana, feeling the weight of those words. He hadn't done it for praise, nor for attention. He had done it because no one had the right to harm his daughter. He had done it out of love and the primal instinct to protect. The officers began clearing the scene, but the energy in the alley remained charged. The truth of what had happened here wouldn't be forgotten. Videos would spread, stories would be told, and Officer Jack Reynolds would forever be remembered not as a man of the law, but as a symbol of its failure, and the power of a father's love to set things right. As the flashing sirens faded into the distance, taking the disgraced Officer Reynolds with them, a profound stillness settled over the alleyway. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm, heavy, reflective, and filled with the weight of what had just transpired. Mike Tyson turned to Lana, his intense expression softening as he took in the sight of his daughter. Her shoulder was bruised, and her face still carried traces of pain, but there was a fierce, unbroken strength in her eyes. He approached her carefully, the raw adrenaline still pulsing through his veins, but his focus was now solely on her. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, his deep voice trembling slightly with emotion. Lana hesitated, the events of the past hour racing through her mind. She felt the soreness in her arm where Reynolds had struck her. But more than that, she felt the overwhelming relief of safety. Her father had been there when she needed him most. She looked up at Mike and gave a small, reassuring smile. "Yeah, Dad," she replied softly. "I am now. Thanks to you." Mike let out a heavy breath, the tension in his chest finally starting to release. He reached out, wrapping his strong arms around her, pulling her into a tight, protective embrace. Lana sank into the hug, feeling the safety in his arms, the warmth, the love, and the sheer power of a father's devotion. For a moment, they stood there silently, father and daughter, the bond between them now stronger than ever. Mike pulled back slightly, placing a large, calloused hand gently on Lana's cheek. "No one lays a hand on my family and gets away with it," he said firmly, his eyes filled with both love and lingering fury. Lana's eyes glistened with tears that she had held back throughout the ordeal. She chuckled lightly through the emotion, wiping her face. "I know, Dad. You proved that today." The crowd that had lingered nearby began to disperse, but many still looked on, deeply moved by the scene. It wasn't just about the fight or the fall of a corrupt officer. It was about something deeper. It was about love, protection, and the strength that comes from standing up for what's right. As the golden sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson, Mike Tyson drove down the quiet suburban street, feeling an unusual sense of peace. It had been a long, grueling day of training, but coming home to his daughter always made it worthwhile. His house, a cozy two-story home nestled among towering trees, stood as a sanctuary away from the chaos of his past life in the ring. Inside, 8-year-old Emily Tyson sat cross-legged on the living room floor, completely absorbed in her favorite cartoon, her beloved teddy bear clutched tightly in her arms. Her laughter echoed softly through the house, a gentle reminder of the innocence and joy that filled their lives. For Tyson, Emily was his world, his reason for pushing forward, for finding redemption beyond the fame and violence of his boxing career. He had built this life for her, a place where she could feel safe, loved, and carefree. The air was filled with the comforting aroma of dinner simmering on the stove, and the soft hum of the TV blended harmoniously with the peaceful sounds of the neighborhood. It was a perfect evening, one that seemed to stand still in time. But peace is fragile. As Tyson's car turned the final corner, a subtle tension crept into the atmosphere, almost imperceptible, like the calm before a storm. In the distance, a dark sedan crawled down the street, its headlights dimmed, moving with unsettling intent. It came to a stop a few houses away, and inside, a shadowy figure watched Tyson's home with cold, calculated eyes. Unbeknownst to Tyson, the tranquility he cherished was about to shatter, plunging him and his daughter into a nightmare from which there might be no escape. Inside the dark sedan, Officer Richard Kane sat motionless, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as he stared at Mike Tyson's house. The glow from a nearby street lamp barely illuminated his hardened face, but the anger burning in his eyes was unmistakable. Kane was no ordinary cop. He was notorious for his deep-seated hatred, particularly towards successful black men like Tyson. His envy had festered for years, fueled by his own failures and the twisted belief that men like Tyson didn't deserve their success. To him, Tyson's life, the fame, the fortune, and especially the loving bond with his daughter, was an insult, a reminder of everything Kane had lost. His jaw clenched as he watched Emily through the living room window, her tiny frame dancing playfully with her teddy bear, completely unaware of the danger lurking outside. Kane's grip tightened even further, his knuckles turning white. "You think you're untouchable, Tyson," he muttered under his breath. "But tonight, I'll take everything from you." The neighborhood was eerily silent, amplifying the darkness that clouded Kane's mind. He reached over to the passenger seat where a gas canister sat ominously, along with a box of matches. His plan wasn't just to hurt Tyson. It was to break him, to make him suffer the ultimate pain, losing the one person he loved most. Kane opened the car door quietly, stepping out into the shadows. His boots made no sound on the pavement as he moved with precision, like a predator stalking its prey. The faint flicker of Emily's cartoon still glowed through the window as Kane approached the house, his heart racing, not from fear, but from the thrill of destruction. A storm was coming, and Kane was its architect. Officer Richard Kane moved through the shadows like a phantom, the gas canister in his gloved hand sloshing with every careful step. His heart pounded in his chest, not from fear or hesitation, but from the adrenaline rush that came with knowing he was about to destroy someone's life. He crouched low beneath the living room window, peeking inside just long enough to see Emily twirling around, her teddy bear in hand, giggling at her favorite cartoon. The sight twisted something dark inside him. Pure, unfiltered hatred. "Let's see how tough you really are, Tyson," he whispered, unscrewing the cap of the gas canister. The strong, acrid smell of gasoline filled the cool night air as he poured it along the house's foundation, splashing it onto the wooden porch steps and the front door. Each splash felt like a nail in Tyson's coffin, the culmination of Kane's years of envy and bitterness. The gasoline soaked into the wood, leaving a dark, wet trail of destruction. Once the canister was empty, Kane pulled a matchbox from his pocket. He struck a match against the rough strip, the flame flickering to life, illuminating his face with a sinister glow. For a brief moment, he hesitated. Not out of mercy, but to savor the moment. "Say goodbye, Tyson," he sneered, before dropping the match onto the gasoline-soaked ground.